So welcome to our fourth week lecture series, and it's a special pleasure to welcome Nils Langer, who, like the guest we had in second week, has also taught paper 4 previously, standing in for Chris Wells, my colleague at St. Edmund Hall. So he has a much longer history with this paper than I going back. And he since moved up and north across the water, but we also share a prehistory up north in England at Newcastle, where Nils Langer studied at the department long before I joined it, but we have really enjoyed exchanging anecdotes about how good the life up north is, whether it's northeast England or north of Germany. So today the topic is language purism, and the main focus of the session will be on contemporary purism and also regional languages and smaller languages. But I'll start with a very short prequel starting from Old High German times, because one topic I'm particularly interested is language mix and what has been called Mönchskauderwelsch by language purism. So just to for those especially joining us today from Flensburg, to see where we are in our lecture series, we have been looking at translation, also between languages, and forms of address, which is also something that is how you address somebody, language of intimacy, language of distance, connected with how formal or pure a language you use. And we'll return to the topic of language purism, looking also at down south Austria, and also language purism comes in several other guises. It will probably come up again with the nationalistic language, talking to Geraldine Horan. But so to my short prelude, what you see here is an 11th century manuscript of a Song of Songs commentary written by the Benedictine abbot Wiliram von Ebersberg. And on the right-hand side, you first see a translation of the Latin "Kusser mich mit dem Kusse seines Mundes," and then you have an explanation in a language mix. "Dico gehiers mir sine Kunft per Prophetas, nu komme selbo und kusse mich mit der Ressource sines Evangelii." So Wiliram uses Latin technical terms, the prophets, and evangelium, the gospel, to mark a contrast, and he also use it for prosodic purposes to end each. And this didn't meet with approval by later copyists. So you have several different forms of rearranging this text, and here you see the attempt to eindeutschen the Latin part. So you see glossing above the lines for most of the Latin hexameters for one of the text. So above the line ego flos campi, you have Felte for campi, et lilium convallium, Gefälle for the valley. But you also see that it was pretty soon given up because it was just too much to move it completely to one language. But the same thing the other way around that happened by the humanists, who were in a way the first language purists to systematically, but they wanted everybody to speak proper Latin. So they removed all the elements of German. So the part I just read you dico gehiers ermesine cunt per prophetas now becomes ante actis quidem etatibus non rarus sponsus neus suum mihi per sanctus prophetas adventum in carnem denunciabit. So this becomes humanist rolling Latin prose. And this marking off as language mix, as negative connotated Mönchskauderwelsch continues across the board. Also, we have a non-Kauderwelsch in the among the nuns of northern Germany, on which Caroline and I are both working, and we might come back to that. But now let's go to over to Nils and linguistic purism in the history of German.
Thank you very much, Henrike, for the introduction. And thank you very much, Martin Durrell, who I was listening to yesterday and in good preparation for this talk. And he basically covered most of it already. So in theory, I could be short, but those who know me will know that I'm not short. Henrike requested that I would bring my Dackel, my sausage dog. Sadly, I'm in my office here because I've got kids at home and that doesn't chime. So I just have a picture of a dog. And this is how I sometimes am laughed at, become so like UKIP. I'm a sort of a single issue person, and I have a mug. Yeah. I don't know if you can read this, but purism kind of features highly in my career. And I do think purism is actually the best of all sociolinguistics topics, because it marries very much. It tells us so much about society rather than just language. Henrike, you need to start clicking on the buttons there. I don't know. Sometimes maybe it's easier just to fill the whole page. But here for the moment, so the sociolinguistics really, you know, giving a lecture like this sometimes gives you an opportunity to think about what does it all mean. No, back. Thank you. And sociolinguistics really, we have sort of two big topics. One is that we can study the sociologically structured patterns of language use. So, you know, certain, you know, whether you say cart as opposed to cart is sociologically meaningful in the UK. It means you're Southwestern, or it means has something to do with your education. Not everybody in Bristol says cart, but those who do, we can normally label them or identify them in a nasty way in terms of sociological background. Or we can study in sociolinguistics the views of linguistic behavior. So this idea that we have a perception, somebody speaks in a certain way, and we immediately have a picture of the identity of this person. And that kind of is runs through my career. As I said, a single issue scholar. I'm interested as to why people are upset about how other people speak, because people are, and that's really quite weird, because it doesn't have to do with communication. People totally understand whether you say cart or cart, yet we still have views about this. And that brings me to the topic of linguistic purism. And here I say that linguistic purism to me is really using language to complain about society. And that's sort of not my bold claim. I think it's pretty trivial, but something for you as fellow scholars and students. I sometimes make absolute claims, and then people are upset about it, but these are meant as provocation and to trigger research. So when I make absolute claims that, you know, they by all means don't believe them and challenge them and bring counterexamples. I do find it interesting. So what I want to talk about today is then motivations, examples, and continuities in the field of linguistics. I do find it striking that everybody, whenever you talk to anyone about language, they will say, of course, language changes, of course. And that's totally, they often say natural, they use biological metaphors, but then when it comes to change in one's own lifetime, people don't accept that as, oh, that's what happens. They normally see that as negative. Click. So some basic definitions, plain definitions. Linguistic purism kind of aims at achieving purity in languages. Well, that's not profound, but obviously we have two controversial terms, namely purity. What could purity possibly mean in language, and what indeed is a language? And can we identify what a language is? It's a term that we use so happily. We use in common discourse. We talk about languages and dialects. and sociologists. What we learn in linguistics, however, is of course that we can't talk about language and dialect, but nobody can really define the difference, and that's why we often talk about varieties. But people think that languages exist. So I have two definitions: one, a narrow understanding of linguistic purism and a wide understanding of linguistic purism. In the Larry Trask's Dictionary of Linguistics, he defines purism as removing foreign elements from a language, so that he narrows it down to foreign elements only. But some other scholars, George Thomas famously, also myself and Agnete Nesse, we wrote a little chapter in a handbook, and we believe in a wider understanding of purism. Purism for us is the aim at removing any undesirable elements from a language. And the reason why we say it's not just foreign elements is because we think the same lines of argument, the same reactions, the same people who complain about foreign words use the same, are found in the evaluation of dialects, of sociolects. Jugendsprache is the big topic there, language contact in different styles, even spelling. I have a colleague in Flensburg here who's embarking on a project about finding out why do people complain and have complained all the time about how people spell and how spelling is taught at school. And that's something that happens in England as well, of course, that people complain, oh, the way that they teach spelling today, that's not right. And the way that I was taught it when I was a child, that's the only way forward. So this reluctance or the resistance to accepting that maybe we could change something for the better. And this is what then Milroy kind of coined. I think they coined the term complaint tradition. And I put in brackets here in italics, Kulturpessimismus. So the idea that the complaint tradition isn't just about language, it's a general Kulturpessimismus. Everything was better in the olden days. And luckily, I'm at an age now where I agree with these people. But I'm also scholarly enough to know that maybe I'm wrong. Though the way that people dress today, young people in particular, the kind of music they listen to, I mean, honestly, who wants to think that's right? The only way, and I tell you this for free, the only time when the Abitur was of decent standard was in 1990, which incidentally was the year that I obtained my Abitur. And before that, it was too hard and traditional. And since then, it's gone downhill. And you have that discourse every August. I don't know whether it's changing complaint. Every August in England, in the UK, when people say, oh, A-level grades, oh, they're all gone up. That means, standards are softening. When the A-level grades are going down, people say, oh, standards are high enough, but the kids don't know nothing no more. So you have that continuing every year. And nobody thinks, that's a bit odd. It can't be going downhill all the time. But it stops where people think about their own A-level, because that was tough. So purism. Purism is always negative. That's another striking thing. You never find a book in popular culture, in broadsheet journalism, where people say, I love the way that the language is currently developing. Or the way the language is, the state of the language is just fine. There was actually a study by the IDS, the Institut für Deutsche Sprache in Mannheim, some 10 years ago or so, where people did state in the foreword that the Stand der deutschen Sprache is okay. It's fine. But journalists don't like that because you can't sell newspaper with this. And it also doesn't chime with their views. They think actually things are going down. So purism is always negative. It's not just a kind of an objective evaluation of the state of the others. And it's normally a complaint about the language of others. It's not the way that, I use some foreign words, I use some spelling variants, I use some new constructions. That's fine. It's the others who get it wrong. And then finally, these complaints mirror society, I believe. Because there's a line missing. It doesn't target. It targets only undesirable languages. Nobody complains about the fact that we use cafe latte, or that I order when I'm proper middle class olive eating. I will order. Could I have the pizza funghi prosciutto, please? That's not bad. That's a good thing because it shows how educated it is. Because Italian is seen, the Italian is sort of the language of food, and that's a good thing if you get it right. Whereas if you use Americanisms or in Germany, German words, that's bad. That destroys the language. Purism rests on certain ideologies. For example, the ideology that there is an existence of discrete discrete and definable linguistic entities, namely languages. People believe that there are such things as languages. Kees Versteeg has a wonderful little paper on ResearchGate, I think, about on the non-existence of languages. And he just takes it completely apart, that there is no such thing as language, yet we use it as a commentary. Of course, there are linguistic entities, of course, that we speak, but to make them as discrete identities is a misnomer. And I always tell my students, and they're always shocked, and that's when they realize that I've clearly lost it and I'm a crazy professor, when I talk to my students of German, that there's no such thing as German. There is a bag that we label German, and in that bag are lots of varieties. But there is no one thing that is German. A second ideology is the existence of birth of languages, so that somehow languages, there is a Stunde Null for any given language. That never happens when this Stunde Null actually happens. So when there's a Creole happening or a particular linguistic variety is happening, nobody can date this back. But when you think about when did German actually start, and Martin Durrell talked about how the word Deutsch first came into being and that it wasn't referring to Deutsch at all. But that's not obviously the day before the language had already existed. So we can't date the birth of languages. And in fact, languages aren't born. Language, the process of languaging is to label a variety, to give it a name, and then suddenly you have it as language. But the ideology that languages are being born is very firmly embedded in society. And then thirdly, the suggestion that languages can decay. Again, this is a common throughout the whole discourse on linguistic purism, that we need to do something about it, because otherwise the language will decay, and once it's decayed, people can't communicate anymore. Now, if you think about something like the contrast between Old English and Middle English, I mean, English is hardly a language anymore. Goodness me, a fixed word order, no endings. The one ending that you do have is S, that you use for plurals and genitives. I mean, how lazy can you be? Yet you would surely argue when the Queen speaks this English, then that's a proper language. Now, anyone who would use measurements and processes of decay would surely say that English is a decayed language, and yet it's clearly not. So maybe that's a suggestion that that decay doesn't exist. I sometimes give papers on the notion of Sprachverfall, and I always open with Sprachverfall doesn't exist in language, but it exists as a belief system. And that's a very strong, powerful thing. James Milroy had a wonderful paper where he argued that Old English, and that the whole idea that we call Old English is a nationalist view in order to show continuity. And he argues the difference between Old English and Middle English is so significant that you couldn't really argue that it's the same language. But because we use the same term for it, we can include it in histories of English's books, and we can demonstrate, and this is the most important point, we can demonstrate how old English culture is. And this applies to German too. Click. Click, click. Okay, and one more click. Yeah, thank you. So my big questions for us then as scholars is, why language? Is there something about language that is particular? When I say this is really about complaint about society, can we find the kind of same complaints in other parts of society, or is language really something special? Who drives the debates about purism? You know, what's right and what's wrong? Who has the authority to say, the way you talk, that's not right? It's different from music. I mean, in music, people say, oh, the music that you listen to, I don't like it. But people rarely would say that's incorrect music or that's not music. I mean, 12 tone, maybe an argument, but who has the authority? Who has the self-ascribed authority? I feel confident enough to say that the way you talk is wrong, and who is given this authority by others to say, oh, the way they speak, that's the right way, and the way that I speak is wrong. And then what lines of argumentations are being used. And this is where we come in historical linguists, especially because we can peek into the past and see, okay, hang on, is that the same thing, or have things changed? And can we boil it down to some common denominators? And that's really why we do historical linguistics, and why historical linguistics is actually much more interesting than modern stuff. And then fourthly, and I've hinted a little bit at the situation in England or in the UK, does this happen in all societies and at all times? So has purism been around since language existed? Has purism been around since structured linguistic societies have existed, i.e. is purism dependent on the existence of, say, a prestige variety or a standard variety. And I want to show you, once I finish with German, I want to give you a couple of slides on North Frisian, both to sell it, because it's pretty cool, but also to see whether, you know, there are differences. I have an actual primary example here from 1653, where Gerbert talks about the Doppelperfekt. Now, I will read this. Das Höfwort, ja, the auxiliary, wird bisweilen seinem Hauptwort in doppelter Weise gebraucht, als ich habe geschrieben gehabt, ich hätte gelesen gehabt, war gestorben gewesen. Now, this is a construction that if you listen to the metalinguistic discourse today, people will say, oh, that's a recent thing. This is an example of how maybe English has influenced German, or how everything, you know, people don't understand anything anymore. It's being complained about because it's redundant. There's too much past, you know, because obviously each has two auxiliaries in it. It's an example where people feel strongly about today. It's an example that you hear throughout Germany all the time, that you never read, to be fair. But that you hear it all the time. You hear it across Germany. It's not just a southern thing. And people say it's a recent thing. Now, here I have an example from 1653. Can't be that recent. And in the final sentence of this example, Gerbert says, es ist aber jetzt so nicht mehr im Gebrauch. So he says it's out of, so we have a sociolinguistic kind of evaluation there. I mean, it's not marked. It's not, oh, only stupid people use it, or only Southerners use it. But it says it's no longer in use. Okay, and this is the kind of, again, how do we study historical linguistics? Well, we rely on that kind of metalinguistic evidence, but we obviously can't take that as truth. We would now then compare it with language use, and then the language use that we can compare it with is then obstructed by the fact that we can obviously only look at written text. Okay, there's a bit of a tricky thing, but here we get a little hint at that the current idea that this is a recent thing is clearly not true. Click. Now, there's one, so the motivations for linguistic purism, and here I follow Gard 2001 and Pfalzgraf 2009. This 2009 is from a book called Landmarks in the History of the German Language. The other place, Cambridge, ran a lecture series on landmarks in the history of the German language 20 years ago or so, and it was published in 2009. And quite a few of your speakers, Henrike, have chapters in this very book. So I don't know whether the history of the German language has changed significantly so that we can update this book, but maybe some chapters are missing actually from this book. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm based on...
Probably at that point, Vogels who kind of convened it.
No, that was a Cambridge thing. It was David Green.
All right.
It was the landmarks, because there's the landmark series in women's writing and all that kind of thing. So yeah. That as an aside, but Pfalzgraf picks up on Gard's discourse, and I quite like them. I don't know whether they're complete. Again, this is maybe a task for you to research which bits are missing. But he just defines, so for Diskurse, all very long adjectives because it's in German. So Sprachstruktureller Diskurs, and the Sprachstruktureller Diskurs is where a pure language structure is perfectly balanced. So the language structure, the syntax, the morphosyntax is perfectly balanced. And change that can damage this perfect balance and, in conclusion, obstruct the communication between speakers. That's one line of argument. Then there's the Sprachideologischer Diskurs. Purity is testament to superiority. Not an easy word for Germans. The older, the purer, and therefore the more superior. The older, the better for languages. And then the Sprachpädagogisch Sprachsoziologischer Diskurs. You can see now why I didn't translate those into English. New words will not be understood by all speakers and hence obstruct communication, which is why we mustn't include new words from the wrong languages, English, not so much with Greek. Greek is good. And then finally, the Sprachkritischer Diskurs, where certain changes are undesirable because they're ugly. They violate aesthetics. And for example, when people use anglicisms like young people do, that's just merely craving attention. That's just fashion. And that's not, that's a kind of a betrayal. Click. So, and I want to go through these four, give a couple of examples of these four discourses. The first one is the Sprachstruktureller Diskurs, and I try to compare these across centuries. So the first one is the Sprachstruktureller Diskurs, which is that the language, that the pure language structure is perfectly balanced. And this dates back to the 17th century. Nicola McLelland will be speaking to you, so she'll be telling you all about Schotelius, who's the leading grammarian in the 17th century, who said, German is better because look at how many words of the core vocabulary are monosyllabic. So they're short, and short is good. And what German can do is it can combine all these monosyllabic words to make really long words. You may have seen German long words. And he put that equality. He took these monosyllabic words as Stammwörter, and he said that's a good thing. Now, that's obviously the interpretation. And he concludes from that German was one of the Hauptsprachen after Babel, right? The confusion of the languages, when certain, God kind of punished the people. And sort of confuse the people. And then one of the real serious scholarly quests in the 17th century and before was to identify the languages that were spoken after Babel. And then obviously everybody has their own candidate. It was a given that Hebrew would be one of them, Greek and Latin, of course, because you can't challenge those languages. But then the question was, is German part of it? And people in the 17th century have quite seriously argued that, say, Noah turned up on the River Rhine and spoke German to his kids. And those are, we find this ridiculous, but at the time that was quite serious. What was good about this Hauptsprache is that French couldn't be part of it, because French was clearly kind of a daughter of Latin. And what you don't like in the 17th century is the America of the time, the culture that nobody likes because everybody likes it. And that was France at the time. So, the German conservatives thought, oh, that's just fanciful fencing, and look at the way they dress. And, so we complain about their culture. And it was really quite handy to say, and their language can't be any good because it can't be old, because it's clearly not original. And Schotelius then also said, so the argument was that German was pure and perfect in a technical sense, as in it has no exceptions. Now, when he looked at German, he said, oh, there are a couple of exceptions. That's a bit annoying. But we can restore the original divine glory of German by getting rid of the exceptions. And that required Spracharbeit, as Haasdorff calls it. Spracharbeit was that you look at the paradigm of verbs, for example, look at all the irregularities, and you repair it, and then you say, this is the regular form of German is the way that we should be speaking it, because that brings us closer to the original form, which is the one after Babel. You can see how that's convincing when you only talk to people who also believe in it. It's not so convincing when you then talk to French people who will say, oh, that's all rubbish. And also required that some language use can become incorrect. So with this idea that German becomes is one of the original things, you look at what we as scholars can do is look at descriptions of the language. And one of the famous examples, for example, the case of wegen. I don't know how they teach it at Oxford. At Bristol, we always like, it's wegen in writing, but a genitive in writing, but dative in speaking. But when you come to Germany and listen to people, well, it's kind of, there's certain trends, but it doesn't really work. And my sort of gold nugget in the whole discussion that only the genitive is correct is then kind of challenged by Gwains in 1641. Gwains in 1641 was one of the leading grammarians. He had a massive wig on, and he was very, very learned. And he, in his Grammar of German, says that wegen and zu nehmen eine Nebenendung, and the Nebenendung is the dative. So the first time we have in a meta-linguistic work, in a grammar, an entry for wegen, and it really is the first one. I looked at the previous ones, and they don't mention it, is that it has the dative. So the government of wegen with dative is very old. It's not a new thing. But then we also see other things. Heinert 1777 is a school book, and he says, es ist unrichtig, wenn man anstatt längst, während und wegen, anstatt des Genitivs mit dem Dativ setzt. Now here we have a clear stigmatization that is all wrong, which obviously tells us that people have done it. So in the language use, it will have been the dative, otherwise he wouldn't have mentioned it. But it's very clearly labeled as plain wrong. Click. And Adelung, then in the late 18th century, says wegen einer Präposition, welches jederzeit, all the time, mit der zweiten Endung, also dem Genitiv, verbunden wird. And then he says, after the brackets, fehlerhaft, so it's wrong, ist es, wenn diese Präposition im Oberdeutschen so gern mit dem Dative verbunden wird. So he's eingrenzen, he's limiting its range to it's only happening in Oberdeutschen, so in the south. And he clearly wasn't from the south, surprise, surprise. And we have these kind of things as well. In 2004, Zick, obviously we looked at all the grammatical descriptions in a book that Winnie Davis and I wrote some years ago. And we just wanted to see the history of the stigmatization. And Zick, for example, says, oh, wegen plus D is ridiculous. You can never, ever do it. And then when you read on his little thing, there are certain exceptions, which is bizarre, right? Why can it be? How can, in the discourse, can they be so firm to say it's wrong and then themselves admit, 10 lines later, that there's an exception? I don't understand. I've never spoken to the man myself, but it's just, the paradox isn't discussed. They think, oh, that's fine. Because people, if you talk to the people who are of your opinion, then that's fine. Nobody will challenge it. Yeah, clickety click. What was it? Okay, and then compare this kind of thing with the 21st century. We have obviously language contact with other languages. Language contact, this is argued. Language contact changes German. Now, that's true for words. I don't know whether it changes the word, it enriches it, and I don't want to evaluate it. There are more words. I don't know whether language contact actually does anything to the morphosyntax of German. I don't see the third gender leaving. I don't see the third grammatical gender. I don't see the word order changing. But people say that, and people say that, for example, the increasing use of English by young people, of course, reduces the young people's expressibility in German. They can't express complex thought anymore as clearly as before. Click. And words like Balkanisierung, Multikulti-Deutsch, and Kiez-Deutsch are used to argue that the young people, listen to them. They just use very short sentences. They only use main clauses. They don't complete the sentences. Their vocabulary is poor. And this Balkanisierung, for example, is coined by Uwe Hinrichs, who's a professor of linguistics and who gave a long radio program on Deutschlandfunk, my hero, the Deutschlandfunk. And I thought, what? That can't be right. But he's a professor of linguistics. Who am I to challenge him? And then I researched him a little bit. And he talked in Balkanisierung, he talked about the state of the German language. And he made some mistakes. And I thought, maybe I got it wrong. And then I checked, no, he's a professor of Slavonic linguistics. So he is an expert on other languages. But then he speaks about this, the decay in his own language. Now, I don't know, it's cheap criticism. And now this is going on the internet. So maybe I get lots of hate mail. But I just find it bizarre that you would, you check, right? And the couple of examples that he used about the decay of the language was, for example, that people don't use the genitive anymore. And I showed you the dative has been around for a long, long time. That's not news, or this doppelperfect. That's not news. It's been around for a long time. It's just not been in writing. It's not been in standard writing for a long time. But this argument is that this language contact, and this is where we get to purism, language contact will make the language poorer. And the people, and this is why we need all be concerned, complex thoughts can no longer be expressed if we let this to happen, if we allow this to happen. And then certain handy things that come into play is other language policy initiatives. And we need to distinguish between language change that happens and language policy initiatives. And language policies initiatives that have been hitting the headlines these days are spelling reform. Okay, that's 20 years old. Gendergerechte Sprache is a big topic at the moment. And this leichte Sprache, I don't know whether you heard about leichte Sprache, but the idea that the Verwaltungsdeutsch is so incomprehensible. And there are people who have difficulty reading and writing complex things, like myself. When I get communication from our Verwaltung, honestly, I need to ask colleagues to help me understand. And so leichte Sprache is an effort to make complex text is slightly more comprehensible by having shorter sentences, by having more hyphens. But actually, it's no different in the language. It's the same language. It's just different words. And on the gendergerechte Sprache, the Verein für deutsche Sprache, who kind of my enemy here, because they worry deeply about the state of language. They now have an appeal that you can sign, please don't, rettet die deutsche Sprache vor dem Duden. And that's beautiful. I saw that yesterday. And I mean, if you look at the people who signed it, lots and lots of people signed it. And the people who signed it are all really highly educated people. The famous people are highly educated people. There are basically no one with degrees in linguistics or who do linguistics. Okay. But the people who do it, they're not stupid, but they are highly educated, concerned citizens. They're not your typical AfD crowd. And it makes you wonder, what are they actually worried about? Now, this particular appeal is about this gendered language. Click. We're doing, okay. Sprachideologischer Diskurs. The second discourse is then on the idea that German is older and thus better than other languages. These four discourses, they all overlap and intertwine a little bit. So this older is better, we hear that in other discourses as well. But because German is older, and that's just given as a fact, I mean, Schutilius argued it with these monosyllabic words, but it's just stated as it is. There are also people, Swedish scholars, who say that Swedish is the oldest language, or there are Dutch scholars who say that Adam and Eve spoke Dutch to each other, and they're not ridiculous. Right? There are serious scholars who argue this. We would now have doubts about this, but who is to tell what language Adam and Eve spoke to each other? But again, because German is older and thus better, we therefore don't need to borrow from younger languages like French. And when we have existing loanwords from Greek and Latin, we should translate these. And there was a sort of a program, Martin Opitz, sort of it was very keen to him in the 17th century, very key to him to demonstrate that German is good enough a language to be used for high poetry, and that's when this Baroque poetry happened. In the 19th century, this Sprachideologischer Diskurs is picked up again with a slightly different spin, namely a more nationalist spin. German is the language of the Germans. Now we have nationalism, the idea that a nation consists of, again, Martin Durrell talked about this at some length, a nation consists of language, tradition, people, and culture, and therefore language is a key asset. And German is the language of the Germans, and the Germans are people with a long cultural tradition. How do we know this? For example, by unearthing and editing medieval texts and Old High German texts. Again, this kind of thing that I said about Old English earlier, same applied in the early 19th century. Lähnemann is what Martin talked about. There was a program. The idea was we need to look into the past to unearth the old treasures of German culture in order to also demonstrate that our culture is, old and therefore good. And in reverse, incorporating foreign elements, i.e. borrowing words from French and English, is a treason to the nation. And this kind of nationalist discourse is not articulated so much today. I don't really see that. For the 21st century, people like the VDS, the Verein für deutsche Sprache, again, these highly educated warriors about the decay of the language, they don't say that German is better. They often use this picture of, we want a Europe of proud nations, each with their own equally important language. And our colleagues in Italy and our colleagues in Spain and our colleagues in France, they should be using their own pure language and worry about this. And we all have a common enemy, handily though, namely American English. So that's always quite easy. If you want to form a coalition, have a common enemy. Click. Thirdly, the sprachsoziologischer Diskurs. That's truly different, because here it's also democratizing. So we need to object to foreign elements because these foreign words are not understood. Johann Heinrich Campe is a famous name in this context. He observed the French Revolution and he was amazed at how these French peasants could engage in political discourse because the words that the political discourse used were normal French words. And Campe then had this program to say, we need to translate our foreign words into German so that the lower classes can participate in this political discourse. So it's a democratizing thing. It was an opening thing. And Martin quoted this Wienbach 1834, über die Ausrottung des Plattdeutschen, and he said, this was aimed at eradicating Low German. What he didn't say, and that was slightly unfair, is that Wienbach, the reason why he wanted to eradicate Low German, wasn't in order because he thought peasants are stupid, but because he said, no, by ausrotting Low German, the dialects, we will force the peasants to speak High German, and therefore they will be empowered to partake in discourse. He said, what if you have a witness at court who can only speak Low German? The judge will not take the testimony seriously, and which is why we need to get rid of the dialect and therefore heben the status of the peasants. So it's a complex little thing. It's not just and clearly didn't work, right? So Low German still exists because language carries identity. In the 21st century, we find this discourse, for example, by the VDS, but lots of other people as well, who say, oh, the use of Anglicism disenfranchises old people from the community of German speakers. So my mother, who still doesn't quite understand the internet and smartphone, all that, she doesn't like it. And if you then use simple things like a Datei uploaden, hochladen, she will not understand. The argument is, therefore, you will disenfranchise these old people from the community. Doesn't actually work as an argument, because if obviously my mother were to engage with the internet, then she would totally pick up these terms, right? It's all dependent on your environment and not on your age. And more importantly, the people who articulate this concern never worry about Greek words or Latin words. They don't worry about Verwaltungssprache. So there are lots of things that disenfranchise me, and I have a PhD in German, goodness me, and I don't understand lots of texts in this country. I mean, seriously, the one big culture shock I had is having to engage with insurances and Verwaltung in Germany. Really, and I'm not jesting, I had to ask more than once colleagues who say, what does this actually mean? And I'm sorry, that may be not my fault when the Verwaltung doesn't manage to talk to me. In England, there was a plain English campaign in the 1980s, and that kind of changed everything. And goodness me, we're a long way back here. But so again, the objection is partial. It's not objecting to words that people don't understand in general, but it's objecting to only the words that the others that I don't understand, Anglicisms. But if I use lots of Greek and Latin in my own language, then that's obviously culture and good. The final discourse then is the Sprachkritischer Diskurs, which is that there are certain changes that are undesirable because they're ugly, they violate my aesthetics, Anglicisms, they're just is horrible. The way the young people just use English words and then they use it incorrectly because they use handy, and handy doesn't mean handy, and goodness me, yeah. So these arguments are all used. But obviously, we find lots of examples. So people think words like old timer or the evergreen, famous borrowings in the 60s. Also don't mean old timer and veteran vehicle and evergreen, a song that's always catchy in English, but that argument isn't used, even though it's the same phenomenon. Well, no, that's okay, because I use old timer and evergreen. So the selectiveness of using arguments. And in the 17th century, what people complained about is it became sort of fashionable for young aristocrats to do their year abroad in France, where they learn how to dance and how to fence and how to horse ride. Obviously their parents' generation kind of objected to this, especially when these young aristocrats came back from their year abroad in France and started talking French, because they kind of forgot the other language. And then they started to say monsieur to the servant. And people objected to this, obviously only the older generation, because they said, well, A, you shouldn't be using French, and B, you're not even doing it right, because if you call your servant monsieur, then you're obviously getting it wrong. I'm not reading this quote, I leave that for you for reasons of time. But here again, we have lots of examples from the 17th century where people complain, the educated middle class, the aristocracy complain about people using French just to be cool. They wouldn't say cool though. Click. And you find this in the 21st century as well. So it is true, presumably, that the use of Anglicisms increased with the presence of GIs and Tommies after the Second World War, with the arrival of rock and roll in the 1950s, with the whole liberation of youth as a sort of eigenständige Lebensphase, as opposed to just being unfinished adults. And people objected to this at the time, even in the 1950s, and they thought it was shocking to see that our young people, our young Germans, use this kulturlose Kultur of Americans in our people. And this is something that still pertains. German purists normally don't call it Amerikanisches English, but often just English. But the discourse in England is obviously not about English, but about American English. Peter Trotkill has wonderful little examples of how certain terrible Americanisms are completely normal English now. Of course they are. Radio, for example, was bitterly complained about in the 1960s for replacing wireless, and you couldn't say radio, that's just American. Nowadays, obviously, wireless has been sort of found a comeback, but in a different meaning. The little picture here is from the Verein für deutsche Sprache, and it shows you exactly and this is of 2017, and it's hinting at this refugee crisis and the multiculti thing. So they're trying to really distance themselves from being racist. I think that's not the case. It's not the AfD crowd, but they're just showing that the guy on the right is obviously he's teaching at the VHS or the evening school, and he's using, he's doing a disservice to these new arrivals, the refugees, by not speaking German. He says, Highlight des Integrationsworkshops Deutsch ist learning by doing durch Coaching von Sightseeing mit Shopping Event. Now, actually, any of us linguists will realize this is perfectly fine German. The only thing that's different is words. But we know that, what is core to a language is grammar, and that there's nothing silly about this. So that example is stupid, and it doesn't even work. But then I would say that. Okay, click. Now, and this is why, I see, and my question then is, how commonplace are these discourses? Are they restricted to German? I've tried to hint at the situation in England a little bit, but now obviously with my new hat on as a North Frisianist and a map of North Frisian there, always present, I want to show you a little bit about North Frisian, maybe also advertise that it is obviously possible to do your year abroad here. If anyone is particularly keen, we might even have a little Praktikumsplatz for you. And then for those who come, I will show you North Frisians and maybe let you even touch one. This is why you should study North Frisian. North Frisian is a minority language on the northwestern coastline of Germany. There's no written tradition really. This is one, again, of my absolute claims that doesn't really hold, but it's a bit true. There's about 5,000 to 7,000 speakers, so it's not many, but there are people, and there are lots of native speakers who are much younger than you are. So it's not it is still transmitted in families, slightly less, the decline. It is declining, but it's declining at a slowed pace. All speakers are bilingual because all speakers were schooled in High German. And it is now that, we have some students here who are native speakers of North Frisian. If you speak to them in German, you will not hear that they have another language as native language. It's very boring, their German. Like my German is very boring standard German. They will sound Northern, but just the way that I sound Northern. But in the metalinguistic debate, when you look at the commentaries when you talk to colleagues, when you talk to people who are in the cultural scene, they have deep concerns by some over changes in the language. The Fries Verein, one of the associations, has on their webpage a word of the week. And the word of the week is typically an old word that is kind of out of use. And they say, this word is rarely used, but the word that everybody uses, that is wrong. You should be using the old word. So they're trying to make kind of, I'm not mocking it. It's fine. As a sociolinguist, I find it interesting that they're doing it. Trying to restore, revive older words. And you find that in lots of other minority languages as well. And the deep concern is normally about borrowing from the big language, about High German. Anyone for you who's been to Austria will hear the same thing, that there's a worry about the changes in language because of the threat from German. So it's the same kind of feeling of we're only the little ones, and then the big ones are usurping us. Same thing, British English, American English. And my question then is, we have the italics are mine, but one of our speakers did her MA dissertation here, and she said she interviewed people, and then she has this example, for example. We hul je zwar te hoepen, aber je befief als je dan spielerisch für us ook al een grenze wen. So, and the question then for us is, and this is obviously mixed languages, Henrike, is that Frisian or not? Now, I kind of cheated because in the original sound clip, there were no italics. And she didn't say, wie höre je, zwar, to hupe, aber, yeah, it's just a normal word, it's a borrowing. So we shouldn't really be italicizing it. But people will say that's not good Frisian, or it's even not Frisian at all. Click. And that brings me to the metalinguistic debate. I've given you, I need to read a bit of Frisian because I need to practice it. So, and that's always the sort of the gimmick thing that we do. But we have here the kind of the same discourse of we need to worry about the enemy. We need to defend our language against the enemy. And Reinhard Afsen in 1957 wrote a school textbook, and he articulated this. He said something like, just so mot usens mamsprek ham vere jende fiend, die van Buitenland kom. Die beskavi halep wie altemal van fe an omran, oorlen en jongen, wufford en kamen, wie aran an afrine on afreem. Dit leseboek Mamsprek skal dus en halperwees, ferring an omrangs prik te waren en te plegen. We will do wat we kunnen voor usens helix erfdeel. So their own language is used as a heiligstes Erbteil, holy heritage, and we have an obligation as speakers of North Frisian to protect and support our language, and we protect it by not speaking, not using foreign words. Click. And to give you the final example, then how this might actually work is the case of sick. Sick is beautiful, is what I have in here. I can't really see it. It's too sunny in Flensburg. That's the problem when you live in northern Germany. Too much good weather. And the case of the reflexive pronoun is a famous case. It's a bit like the wegen plus dative in Germany, or the split infinitives in English. Yeah, it's a big famous example. In A, this is what normally is of the norm. Hit twight ham. Compare English, it washes himself, wäscht sich. But we also hear lots and lots of times hit twight sick. So there's two reflexive pronouns, and they're kind of alternating. We have one student who's trying to work out whether there's any pattern as to which one who uses which at what time. But it just seems to be alternating. There seem to be certain tendencies that those people who had Frisian at school use ham. Okay, but the native speakers who didn't use both, and it depends a bit on what village you're from. Click. Now this this pronoun has been attested from the earliest text. The earliest text of North Frisian are from 1600, so not that old. But there we have the zig already. And the complaint about the construction date back to at least the 1950s. I was one teacher called it the hässliche Entlein. And here I have a quote from 1972 where a famous leader of the Frisian movement complains that in what is the language decays more and more, but what's completely new to me now is that older people who 20 or 30 years ago spoke correctly now also copy the incorrect Frisian of their children. Now that would be fundamental news, that old speakers adapt their language to young speakers. Right? That'd be really strange for a sociolinguistic point of view. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think it's worth investigating, but maybe his impression is wrong. Maybe his filtered view of what's happening is wrong. And he says that even now, young people and old people, they all use sig. Now this was from 1972, a long time ago. For you, not for me, not so much. And then it brings us this idea, the effect of school teaching. So how can language change actually happen? And here we have interview data from 2019, where one of our native speaker students interviewed all her mates on the island of Föhr, and she's interviewed this informant number 5. He says, nee, aber hören, also ik zelf hou una Oberstufe eindelijk eerst recht leert, verring te schrijven en ook alles te snaken, anders zu sprechen. And uw schoolmaster, he is to besbaldet sick on so wat utprügelt. Okay, so the teacher kind of got rid of this, a bit like how our teacher got rid of the wegen plus dative out of us, and we would never write it, or the doppelperfect, we would never write it, because not because that's part of our natural language, but because top-down language policy. And then our informant said, "Ja, oh, die habe ich auch gesagt." Yeah, so she herself chimes in with this impression, saying, "Yeah, we used to say it, but then we went to school and we were told this is incorrect." Click. And there's a certain irony then. That on the one hand, if you do minority language linguistics, you are about protecting linguistic human rights. The reason why we support and protect minority languages is we say every speaker has the right to their language, to speak the way they want to. And it's not acceptable to say that just because you're a low German speaker or a Frisian speaker that you're stupid. You have a right to have your own language. But with this invention of linguistic norms through, for example, codification, to the publication of dictionaries and grammars, you kind of deem certain uses of the minority languages incorrect and inauthentic. And this is what then happens here, that we have native speakers who are in their 20s, who use Zik, are being discriminated against. They don't see it, and they say, oh, that's just how it is, that's how school works. But suddenly they're being told that their native language is incorrect. And we also have other examples where people, and this is then more serious, where people say, I don't like speaking Frisian anymore with certain people, because they keep correcting me. Sometimes these people are new speakers, i.e. people who learned the language at the university. And then the big question is then, who owns the language? Normally you'd say the language is owned by the native speakers. Okay, boring. But here, no. The language is owned by those people who tell other people how to speak. And therefore, and this is then why it's interesting to compare things and to look at history and modern stuff and to compare different languages. Studying minority language linguistics allows us to study general processes of language. And to me, what's happening for North Frisian is absolutely the same that I can see in the history of German. Click. And so finally, then to revisit the big questions. One, why language? Well, because it's a common good, and it's an identifier of in-group belonging, and also to exclude people. Who drives the debates? It's the older educated people like me, sadly, i.e., and that's the fascinating thing, the most secure members of society. So they're ones who really have nothing to worry about. They're the ones who complain about others. The Verein für deutsche Sprache has 38,000 members. The Vorstand, the executive committee, is highly educated, but there are really no academic linguists in there. There are 3 black sheep in the Beirat now, and we're all like, what are you doing there? Okay, what lines of argumentations are used? Well, one thing is that change is bad if the change happened after I fix my cultural norms. You fix your cultural norms in your golden age, i.e. between, 5 and 25. Everything that's changing then, that's fine, that's cool. Everything that happens afterwards is bad. And does this happen in all society in all times? Well, complaints about confusion of Greek words already found in ancient Rome. Kate Burridge has one exception. Kate Burridge investigated Canadian Mennonite Germans, where these Canadian Mennonite Germans, they apparently have no problem with borrowing from English. They say, oh, the kids, they speak lots of English, blah, blah, no problem. But that's an amazing example. So we don't know we can't put that in the world map. Right, click, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Niels. Good fun and covered a lot of, as you said yourself, questions that have come up time and again in the course of the lecture series. I would have lots of examples or questions, but I'll hand over first to Louisa and Caroline, who are both teaching the tutorials for paper 4 and wanted to link to other topics. So over to Louisa.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. My question is more general question, because what strikes me the most when looking at purism is that is, as you showed very clearly, something that happens again and again and again over centuries. So this movement is kind of it's a very old way of thinking, but it's still something that happens today, and kind of that also shows how much power people think a language has. Which is, for me as a linguist, also very fascinating. And so I thought maybe you could show some, or maybe you know some examples of, because in the end, I mean, the language develops naturally in a way. I mean, you can try to impose your own beliefs onto the language and try to change it, but in the end, as we can see over the centuries, linguistic changes like the loss of endings, or even that borrowings are accepted into the language, they just happen, and So my kind of general question is, how much power do you think purist movements can actually or do actually have on language or language change?
I think they do have an effect on where you can have an effect. So on the codified norm and enforcing it, for example, in schools or so every newspaper, every broadcasting station have sort of Richtlinien, guidelines about good language use. The Journalistenschule, one of the guys who writes about good and bad German is Wolf Schneider, who was running the Journalistenschule for many years. So you can implement this, you can korrigieren, you can actually correct people's written usage, and you can therefore instill this view that certain things are right or wrong. That doesn't mean that I don't use double perfect, and people do. And I've had the discussion with people, in the train, say, oh, interesting about what you do. Oh, I work on funny things, like the double perfect. And this person, I remember it now, she said, oh, well, I would never use this. And I thought, you just used it. She used it 2 sentences ago. Is it exactly why I came up with the example? And she said, oh, yeah, well, slip. Right? The self-denial, or the weil plus verb second. There's always people like Martin Durrell are the people who would open a paper on weil plus verb second saying, I'm talking about the construction that Germans deny they ever use. And we deny it quite consciously. We don't believe that we use it, and yet we use it all the time, of course. You can enforce it when you, and again, with what example with the Frisian thing. So these 2 people have changed the language use because they were told it's wrong. I now forbid my students to say, write something like Sprache verändert sich, which is sort of a common thing, but it's obviously not Sprache that verändert sich, because Sprache is not a living thing. It can't verändern sich. This agentivity of language, this conceptualization that it's something that's been biological, decay, birth, death, our biological metaphors that are completely inapplicable. But I think you can do this. But Winnie Davis and Melanie Wagner, her MA student, a PhD student, they looked at Korrekturpraktiken in secondary schools in Rheinland-Pfalz or so. And all the teachers said, no. We don't allow dialect. We have lots of dialect speakers, but we only teach standard German, and we go completely along what's right and what's wrong. I mean, and then look at what kind we gave them, so example sentences. And there was lots of different things. Yeah, it wasn't, they believed in homogeneity, but what they correct and mark as right and wrong would be different from what I do. And that ties into this big debate that we have in Germany at the moment as to whether the German language is pluricentric or pluriarial, right? And the pluriarials who say there are lots of standard varieties. And what I consider standard is not what you consider standard. But we would both say to the public, because we don't reflect on it, no, there's only one standard. There's only one way of writing, even though it's not true. So I think teachers, they have a big lever. If you give, who are the norm authorities? The norm authorities are the people who have a pen in their hand and allowed to say this is wrong.
Thank you so much. That actually adds up quite well to what I wanted to ask. Sorry, Henrike, I made a change because actually I think it's interesting to discuss the effectiveness of purist attempts and to also focus counter-purist attempts. Like when I was introduced to primary school, I was one of the very first cohorts which actually had to learn the new orthography introduced by the German orthography reform. And I quite well remember that this was highly controversial and that also magazines back then refused to adopt to the new rules. So my question is that one of the prominent or latest example of actually a long tradition of counter-purist actions which are hidden because maybe we don't really emphasize this enough in research or not focusing on it enough because we might be so interested in purism because we think it's actually something curious or something very interesting because we all have certain feelings towards purism, but we never really indeed talk about counter actions.
But the spelling reform is not the purest one. The reaction is the purest one. The reaction is to say they are changing die Sprache der Dichter und Denker. And you think, well, why do I even start? They're changing the spelling, not the language. Secondly, look at Schiller and Goethe in the original. I mean, Goethe signed his name in 4 different ways. It's insane. And thirdly, I mean, spelling reform, before the spelling reform, Autofahren and Radfahren would be spelled differently. I mean, it was a tiny Stellschrauben-Adjustierung to get rid of the most ridiculous exceptions. Yet, the outrage was exactly by the same people. The Verein für deutsche Sprache, originally the Verein zur Wahrung der deutschen Sprache, was founded in 1997. And I'm sure that's not a coincidence. That's right when the spelling reform was sort of introduced in 96 to start in 98, but most people then already started in 96. And there was a massive outrage. And if you look at the lines of argument, they are absurd. I like a good example, a counter argument to my view. Yeah, if I'm wrong, fine, but please be coherent. But no, everything was, oh, Kulturverlust und Sprache und Goethe und Schiller. Wirklich, wow. But why do they get so upset about it? Because they now say, ich lasse mir doch vom Staat nicht sagen, wie ich zu schreiben habe. And you're thinking, that's exactly how you learn how to spell. But somebody drilling here. But the argument was that, muss mit und dann Ästhetik war da, muss mit SZ sieht viel besser aus. And you think, yeah, I know, but that's because you learned it, not because it's better. Diese Absolutierung von Ästhetik. So yeah, I think but that's not an anti-purist thing. The only people that are anti-purist are academic linguists. And whenever even, kannst du hören oder nicht?
It's fine, yeah.
It's fine.
The only time when people like the Zeit and Spiegel, they do a special on language. Every 10 years or so, they do a special on language. They invite literary scholar, they invite maybe medievalists, they invite a TV moderator, they invite all sorts of people, but never an academic linguist.
Well, we are linguists, medievalists.
Yeah, Henrike, you know what I mean, yeah? People who, and this is the irony, then the people say, oh yeah, damals hat man noch, also das Mittelhochdeutsch ist ja wunderschön. I say, hang on, how does that make sense?
Actually, when the debate was on about spelling reform, the medieval department at Tübingen proposed to go radical and to get rid of all the uppercase letters and to finally implement how the Brothers Grimm would have spelled as something much more sophisticated. So we all argued that it didn't.
Wird hier